All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Today or tonight, whenever you're watching this, we are going to talk about wine barrels, aging, and tertiary aromas. I think this is a super fun presentation. This brings together a lot of concepts with winemaking and like sommelier training, which is really fun. And it helps to solve some of like the big mysteries about like why does aged wine typically cost more and why does it typically taste better, right? So we're going to get into that today. So, first of all, we're going to cover like a history of wine barrels, right? So we'll talk about barrels, barrel aging, and then specifically what happens to wine as it ages, right? And what you can expect for different styles of wine in that case. So for a history of wine barrels, right? So barrels were not originally used, as far as we know, to impart flavors and aromas into wine, right? So if you go wine tasting, there's a lot of discussions about like, oh, French versus American oak, and how long did you age it for, and what percentage of new oak did you use versus neutral oak, right? So it wasn't that way. Originally, it was just for transport and storage, right? So before wines were readily available to purchase by the bottle, they were actually purchased by the barrel, right? So it sounds like a good time. So the first evidence of barrels that we see is actually dates back to Mesopotamia, and they were made with palm tree wood, right? Amphorae were more prevalent in archaeological findings, but they think that there could have been a lot of wood as well. They just didn't hold up like clay pots did because wood decays over time. And unless it becomes like petrified or fossilized in some way, there's not really a way that wood would last that long, right? So over time, oak became adopted as it was noted to help shape the quality of wines. That was much farther down the line, right? So originally used for storage, transport, for selling, and then over time, we started to notice that, hey, the stuff that's in the wood is actually pretty good. So we're just going to keep doing that. So that's kind of where it started to originate, right? So we have that. So why do we still use oak after all of this time, right? Is this just like a gimmick? It's a tradition, right? Well, it's not. It turns out that it works out really well and it does a lot of positive things. We're just going to keep using that, right? So research and technology hasn't changed and improved in developing these barrels and specifically oak. So that's nice, but it's something that we did right, and we're just gonna keep doing it, right? So oak, specifically as a wood for barrels, works really well because it doesn't rot when it comes in contact with moisture. Oak is extremely hardy. I spent a lot of summers chopping and stacking oak for our wood stoves at home, and oak was always the heaviest of the wood, right? So it's really dense, really tightly packed, and when it burns, it actually produces a ton of heat for a house. So it's a really good type of wood to have around. Luckily, a lot of us have converted to pellet stoves now up in the woods, so I don't have to worry about that. But anyways, so oak is a fantastic, um, you know, type of wood. Also, the cool thing about oak for wine is it flexes nicely when the heat is applied to it. Also, the texture is so dense it doesn't allow for liquid leaking, but it does allow for some oxygen to pass through. And as we're going to discuss in a couple of slides, oxygen is actually your friend in the aging process. Just little bits of oxygen. You don't want a ton of oxygen. There's such thing as way too much, right? And it will go bad. So it allows some oxygen to pass through. It does add flavor, tannin, and texture to a wine. Also, oak barrels can last for many years when taken care of, and they can be reused and repurposed, which is really nice, right? So we have lots of neutral oak barrels at Boger. So neutral meaning that they don't impart any more flavors into the wine. They're just strictly a aging vessel. So it allows for that micro oxygenation into the wine, and it allows it to age nicely in the barrel. But we have barrels that are older than me at Boger that are still holding up just fine, right? So as long as you take care of your barrel and keep that seal, you should be in a really good spot. Yeah. And if some of that sounded crazy to you, we're going to hop into that, so don't worry in this presentation. Okay, so common barrels today, right? Oak is the most popular barrel that we see for winemaking, but barrels can be made from different types of wood that are not of the oak, family. So there's cherry, acacia, koa wood from Hawaii, lots of other things can be made into a barrel shaped to hold wine. What we're discovering is they aren't becoming extremely popular because oak is so dense and it holds a seal so nicely for a liquid like wine. A lot of these other woods, like acacia and koa, they leak a lot, they don't last very long, and they're very expensive to make because it's a very specialty wood that they don't grow a lot of, like oak. So they are being made, but they just aren't holding up to the same as oak is, right? Oak itself gives more tannin, vanilla, tea, and tobacco-like characteristics. And there's different types of oak. So if you go for a wine tasting, some of the common questions that winemakers will get, or something that they like to talk about their wines, is what type of oak they use in their wines, if they use oak. So you might hear in the conversation, oh, I use French oak in this Pinot Noir, or oh, for this Zinfandel, I really like to do a heavy American oak, or maybe I do a blend of different oaks, right? And then also the Hungarian oak is another really common oak that's found in the industry that you can purchase for your wine, which is really cool. So with that, there are certain species that are traditional to those regions, right? So for French oak, you'll see like Quercus robur, Quercus petrea. For American oak, Quercus alba is a really popular one. And then for Hungarian oak, Quercus frenetto is the like Hungarian species. But interestingly enough, in Hungary, they actually grow French oak species for their barrels as well. And it's a lot less expensive too. So I know the climates are different, but if you're more of a species nerd, maybe it's the same for you, right? So that's kind of interesting. I do have a link on YouTube on how wine barrels are made if you'd like to check it out. It's really cool. As a class, we got to go to Seguin Moreau for one of our field trips in Napa, and we got to see how the barrels were made up close. We got to see them being toasted. We got to see the coopers working with them and putting together the staves, which was really cool. So I highly recommend you watch the video. The barrel making process is one of the coolest crafts of the winemaking trade, in my opinion. Okay, so with that, we have a picture of a barrel here, and here is just some anatomy of the barrel for you to know, right? So the big one that we always like to point out, right, is the bung. That's the portion that covers and seals the barrel, protects it from oxidation, any pests like fruit flies or anything like that. The hole that the bung goes into is literally called the bung hole. People always love that on tours. It's always a fun talking point, right? And then as far as like the ends of the barrel, those are called the heads. So it doesn't matter which side, they're both called the head. That's just like the face of the barrel because the barrel is typically stored on its side, right? So it's the head. And then we have, you know, a branding here of whatever Cooper made this. It could be the Cooper brand, but they could also brand the winery logo on the heads too, which I love when they do that. I think that's super cool. And there's more information about the barrel. It could be the species, it could be the lot that it was produced, right? And more. So generally speaking, not generally, always, what's held together for a wine barrel are these metal rings. These are called hoops. And a barrel kind of starts small and then kind of bows out, right? So it's almost like a boat shape, right? So these hoops are different sizes. They get larger as they get towards the center. And then they have these rivets that keep them in place, right? And the cool thing about a barrel is that just by keep putting these staves next to each other, it actually forms a liquid tight seal. We don't use any type of glue or anything like that. During the barrel making process, I did see that they use a glue-like substance for the head. It actually ends up being like pizza dough. It's like flour and water. It's crazy. And they use it to seal the heads on either side. However, with a lot of people becoming or discovering that they're gluten-free, right? They have converted to rice flour. So that way, if any customers are concerned about gluten, the coopers are adjusting and they're using rice flour instead of their traditional flour now, which I think is really cool. So something fun. Okay, but you don't have to memorize all of this. This is just for your information, right? And then as far as toasting for barrels, there's typically a light, medium plus heavy toast. That's the amount of char that's applied to the inner portion of the barrel that imparts flavors into the wine, which is really cool. And depending on the barrel type, right, French, American, Hungarian, etc., the level of toasting, this just provides layers and layers of flavors and options for the wine that's being made, which is really cool. Okay, barrel care and maintenance. Barrels have to constantly be cared for. They are very expensive and they require maintenance. So if a barrel is left empty, it's the worst thing that you could do because it will dry out. And as it dries, the wood shrinks. And as wood is exposed to moisture, it expands, right? So that wood needs to be kept moisturized so that way it keeps that seal. So all these little wood staves that you see here along the side, this was a barrel, a brand new barrel, as you can see, that was starting to leak because it got dry. So what we do, essentially, we put a hose into here, we fill it full of water, and then we let the wood soak up that water and reform a seal. And they will reform a seal. It's pretty crazy, but it takes a lot of water, which is not great, right? The other thing that wood barrels are really prone to is destruction from boring beetles. So these little beetles will come in and they're really prominent during the spring and summer months, right? With all the other bugs. And they come in and they love to eat wood and they just drill a little hole through the barrel and then wine starts leaking out and it's a mess. And essentially you have to go through and repair these barrels. You can use like those little bamboo wooden skewers. You can get specific ones from the cooper that are nicer. And you can go in and make those repairs to the barrel and they should be okay. But generally speaking, because of these beetles, you want to make sure you don't store your barrels outside. So they're going to get eaten alive by these bugs. You want them inside and in a cool cellar because the cool temperature will actually be less friendly to these bugs, right? So you want to make sure you do that. So anyways, a little bit of barrel information for you there. So how does oak actually help wine, right? So we're going to go through 3 different sections of this. We have evaporation and oxygenation, imparting new flavors and aromas to the wine, and then imparting tannins, right? So tannins is not a part of flavors and aromas because tannin is a mouthfeel component. That's more of the texture side of things versus flavors and aroma would be like the vanilla, tobacco, chocolate, things like that that the oak adds to the wine, right? So for evaporation and oxygenation, we see a concentration of flavors and aromas, and it also softens the wine tannins. We're going to get more in depth in this in the next couple slides. And then for imparting new flavors and aromas, phenols in the wood produce vanilla and other flavors, depending on the oak type and toast. And then imparting tannins, this comes from the lignin structures of the wood and protect the wine from severe oxidation and reduction, which is nice, right? So I put a star on this slide because this is definitely going to be a quiz question, right? But this is like a major component that I want you to memorize, right? So if someone were to ask you, how does oak help wine? You'd be able to pull these 3 things out of your back pocket, right? So that would be super helpful. And this is just helpful too. You have these conversations in the industry, and these are like the foundations of what you should know, right? Every winemaker, wine sommelier, consumer, lover should know these things, right? Okay, so let's get into it. So evaporation and oxygenation, right? So evaporation does occur. So over time, as a wine ages, it'll evaporate from the pores of the barrels. And as that happens, it actually concentrates and intensifies the flavors of the wine, which is really cool. So it's one of the benefits of aging a red wine. It becomes way more intense, right? Next, we see microoxygenation. So even though we see evaporation, we also see a very slight ingress of oxygen through the pores of the barrels. And that's why we call it microoxygenation. So this helps to smooth out tannins, prevent reductive aromas, and then also add color stability in wine. So color will fade in wine over time. It's what that aging process does to help excuse me, to make that stable, right? So it's a very complex chemical reaction, but the oak in the microoxygenation helps that color to be stable and last longer in the wine, right? Another thing to talk about with the evaporation portion is something called the angel's share. So as wine evaporates from the barrel, this is like a very common industry term that we use for a wine that has evaporated from the barrels. We call it the angel's share, right? And then on the flip side of that coin, we do have a joke in the industry that's not so commonly known, something called the devil's cut. And that's any money paid in taxes for a wine and any wine that's spilled down the drains on accident. That's called the devil's cut. So that's kind of a fun little flip side, right? So for bottle aging, right, this is where we see like the 2 sides of the coin for barrel aging versus bottle aging. So I wanted to make sure I included information in this presentation for you of like the winemaking perspective of what's happening in the barrel and the sommelier perspective of what's happening in the bottle as it ages, right? So in bottle aging, exposure to oxygen typically creates nutty characteristics in wine, right? And so we're talking about like the oxygen that's wanted that passes through the cork, right? So this would be hazelnut, almond, walnut, and peanut. So all those nutty components come from oxygen specifically, right? Okay, so that was evaporation and oxygenation. Next, we have the new flavors and aromas that are being imparted. So if you have new oak or newer oak, it's going to impart flavors into the wine, which is really cool. It's why you see a lot of wineries spending a lot of money on new barrels every year. You don't have to replace the entire inventory of barrels in your winery, but a lot of winemakers will do like, oh, I do 20% new oak every year, 20%, 30% new oak, right? So they're replacing, they're cycling out barrels as they go, right? So you have flavors being imparted for the first 3 vintages of a barrel's life. Then after that 3rd vintage, it typically goes neutral. And you could keep those barrels, but they're not imparting any flavors anymore. So if you wanted to make wine that imparted flavors, you need to keep purchasing more oak, right? So, and that's expensive. So, new oak imparts flavors of cinnamon, allspice, vanilla, and much, much more, right? So things that would affect the flavors and aromas of that would be the type of wood, right? So if it's oak, acacia, cherry, right? Also if it's French versus American versus Hungarian oak, right? The toast, so that's the charring on the inside of the barrel. So if it's light, medium plus, heavy toast, that can also affect the flavors and aromas as well. And then also where the oak was grown. So this is a really cool thing because this is like the concept of terroir in wine, but with wood, which is really cool. So the climate, right? The surrounding flora and fauna, how the forest was taken care of, how much they let the tree grow before they start harvesting the wood, right? It was very common for oak trees in France to be over 100 years old before they were harvested. Now we're creeping towards 60, either 80 or 60. So there's been such a high demand for oak, they can't let them age as long before they harvest them, right? And so it takes a lot of work to harvest them. They want the wood to be very straight, it needs to be basically perfect for it to be used for a barrel. So the more it can age and the more it can grow vertically straight and beautifully perfect, the higher the quality of the wood and the more that they can charge for it. So that's kind of an interesting thing, right? So for wood, the grain is really important. So you want a finer grain because that's considered higher quality because you have less evaporation, you have a better seal, and more of a subtle, elegant oak influence on wine, right? So that would be produced from a oak tree or wood that came from a cooler climate, so France, right? So that's why French oak barrels are so expensive, right? Okay, so it's a little bit about that. In bottle aging, oak flavors become more pronounced. So all those flavors that were imparted, the cinnamon, allspice, vanilla, clove, those become more pronounced as a wine ages, right? So a young wine will have a lot of fruit. The oak influence as it ages will bring out a lot more of those really beautiful baking spices and vanilla and even like cigar, depending on the oak, right? So I love this chart. I've stolen this chart from the internet. I use it in all my slides. It just shows a general trend, a general chart of different types of oak and different toasts. And so depending, if you want to get really nitty gritty into it, depending on the cooper that you're working with, they're going to have their own chart for you and their own barrels, and they're going to tell you their own things, right? This is a very general one taken from online, but every cooper is different. So, and another really interesting thing that we learned on our trip to Seguin Moreau was that a medium toast for one cooper is not the same as medium toast for another cooper. Like there is not a standard. It's just relative to what they make, right? So I thought that was really interesting. So definitely do some trials if you're considering buying barrels from a cooper, or tasting some wines that were made with those barrels, so you can really see what that oak actually does to the product. Okay, so we have 3 different oaks here: American, French, and Hungarian. We have light, medium, and heavy toast for each. So take a look and just see how different these are, right? And also you can start to see the generalizations of the flavors that are imparted from each one, right? So American oak, American always has vanilla. Almost always you can taste vanilla from American oak. The most common toast used in the industry is medium or medium plus. Light and heavy toast exists. Some winemakers use it, but from my experience, medium toast has been the most popular of what was actually used in the cellar. So American oak, we get a lot of vanilla and a lot of like sweet flavors, right? So like we're talking about like a medium toast here, caramel, toast, roasted nut, strong coconut, roasted coffee, and cocoa, right? So that is very much like a stereotypical American oak influence. For French, we get a lot more of like baking spices and cigar box. Also, French oak tends to be a lot more subtle. American oak was like boom in your face, right? It's like you're being slapped around by oak, right? But French oak is very subtle and very like reserved, right? And then for Hungarian oak, generally, I don't have a ton of experience with Hungarian oak. We used to do a Pinot Noir with Hungarian at one of the wineries that I worked at. But we did a lower influence because Pinot Noir is such a light wine, right? But generally, you can see some sarsaparilla, which I thought was really interesting, butterscotch, banana, and sweet spice, right? So I thought that was really interesting. But you can see how the flavors evolve depending on the toast, what you're working with, right? And then I put this note here at the bottom, which I thought was really interesting. So for white wines that are aged in oak, those are typically barrels that don't receive a toast. Those are typically barrels that are steam treated instead of being charred. So that way they can bend the staves and then create the seal in the barrel. But they don't want any like charred characteristics in the white wine. So a lot of times those will just be steam treated, which are really interesting. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so American versus French, right? This is always a great question in class. So American oak has a wider grain. It grows faster, right? So that makes sense. You think about plants, right? If it grows faster, there's a lot more space there, right? Because of that wider grain, it allows for more oxidation than the French wine. So it allows more oxygen in during the aging process. Less tannins in these wines, but lots of vanilla, coconut, cream soda flavors, right? And also it's known for giving a very creamy texture and potent flavors in the wine, which is cool, right? So I think for a very long time, really big fruity zins aged in American oak with that big vanilla and creaminess was really popular. I think it's still popular in the marketplace. There's still a place for that. A lot of like European or like old world styled wines, right, will be more of like that French oak experience. So French oak has a finer grain as less oxidation allows during the aging process. It grows slower. So that's one of the reasons it's so expensive, because you have to wait so much longer for that tree to grow, right? Also, it gives more tannins, so you get more mouthfeel. And here we see a lot different flavors like cedar, cigar box, dark chocolate, nutmeg, and allspice. So a lot of baking spices and kind of cigar. And for French oak, it's known to give more silky textures and wine and subtle flavors compared to like the big, potent, creamy bomb of American oak, right? And also something kind of cool to note, you can do a blend of these oaks in a wine. You don't have to just do American or French. You could do both if you wanted. So that's kind of like where the real excitement of winemaking comes in, is when you can start to experiment and see what you like and see what works. So very cool. Okay. Oak imparts tannins into wine, right? Tannins can be a very big conversation in class as we talk about tasting and talking about quality, right, and structure. So tannins are a very complex chemical conversation, right? So if you don't have a background in chemistry, it's okay, right? We'll try to keep this like very informative, but also more accessible to learn, right? So tannins are a class of astringent polyphenolic biomolecules, right? Say that 5 times fast, right? It's found in many plants, but for the purposes of wine, tannins are found in grape skins, seeds, and stems, right? So tannins come from the fruit itself during the winemaking process. As you're fermenting on the skins and the seeds, even removing the stems, right, you're still going to get tannin from the skins and the seeds. Oak barrels also impart tannins that help preserve wine and give it mouthfeel and texture, right? So you're getting tannins from the fruit and from the oak at this point, right? Tannins as a whole have a drying sensation in your mouth when drinking wine because they interact with proteins in your saliva and they'll precipitate them out. So actually denature the enzymes in your mouth. And that's why it creates that drying sensation, is because your saliva is literally being sucked out of your mouth. So really interesting there, right? So the cool thing about tannins is like here is a single tannin molecule. This is gallic acid here. Oh, go back on the left. You can see there's like a benzene ring, and then we see a carboxylic acid group, and then we see a bunch of like alcohol groups here, right? That is a single tannin. That's what's interacting with your mouth to create that drying sensation. As a wine ages, these single molecules start to form chains, right? They polymerize, as we say. Poly means many, right? They polymerize, they come together, and then they create this massive complex network of chain. It looks like this on the bottom here, right? So this is a polymeric tannin chain. Because of that, because it becomes such a large molecule, it doesn't interact with your saliva anymore. And that's why wine tastes smoother as it ages. So these tannins don't just disappear, they smooth out because they're forming these polymeric chains with each other, which is really cool. So that's what's happening as wine ages. Okay, next we have texture. So tannins provide texture. We haven't gotten to this part of class yet, but we go from taste to touch. Texture is the physical sensation in your mouth, right, for wine. So tannins provide astringency, contributing to wine texture and mouthfeel. They bind with your proteins, make you feel dry. They also provide a full or round texture. Ideally, you don't want an angular or a donut texture in your mouth. This part came from a wine tasting book. The donut texture means that it covered all the parts of your tongue except for the center, right? So that I've never experienced that, at least not that I've known of. Some wine writer who published a book swore by it, but I'll leave it there. If you experience that and you agree, fantastic, right? But if not, don't worry about it. Another thing to kind of add too is when we talk about tannins and tasting, there's a difference between green and unripe tannins versus ripe tannins. So green and unripe tannins are not considered good, right? So they will taste like you're chewing on a green stick of some kind, right? Something leafy and vegetal, and it'll have this really kind of astringent, kind of like sensation in your mouth, right? For ripe tannins, when you think about ripe tannins, think about like the tannins that come from black tea, right? If you've ever had black tea before without any cream or sugar, right? Black tea brewed at full strength has tannins, and it's a drying sensation, but it's ripe flavors because you're getting the black tea leaves of that flavor, right? So that's the best way I can describe it for now. So just think about that. So they're both a drying sensation, but one is not so pleasant. Okay, so that is kind of an overview about what oak barrels do to wine. Now we're going to continue the conversation of wine aging and like decisions and styles and the flavors that are created during aging, and also what makes a wine ageable, right? So kind of changing gears here, right? So for wine aging decisions, there's a lot of options that can be done on the winemaking side. So one that we like to talk about is sur lie. So sur lie means leaving the wine on lees. This is a French method. And this is all of the leftover yeast and bacteria that has settled to the bottom of the tank and created like this layer of at the bottom. So here we have a barrel on this left side. This, you might be able to see this kind of white haze at the bottom of the barrel. These are glass lids. They're either glass or some kind of really intense food grade plastic to keep the seal. But anyways, you see this film at the bottom. That is all the yeast and bacteria that's fallen to the bottom of the barrel. And then here on the right side, this one looks really cloudy. So someone had just came over and stirred up this lees, right? So all that yeast and bacteria is now in suspension. And as the wine ages, that yeast and bacteria basically come apart and release all this really nice mouthfeel components into the wine. And it helps to contribute that mouthfeel and creaminess to the wine, but also leave a yeasty aroma. So yeast in the way of thinking like bread, right? So like fresh baked bread, or like desserts and pastry, stuff like that. So that is a very positive thing, right? Generally in winemaking, we remove the wine from that lees and then we clean up the barrel, then we put the wine back and let it age that way. So that is an option for wine aging decisions and styles. And of course, that is a tertiary aroma. All of these are tertiary aromas. Okay, Madeirizing. So Madeira, you might not have had it before. It's been around for a very long time. And this is a winemaking style where you expose the wine to heat, you cook it, you oxidize it, and then you let it be, right? As you can see from the picture, it looks like there's almost like a glass of like flat Coca-Cola over here. That's because the wine has been cooked and oxidized. So that's why it is brown. And it is purposefully brown. It's done that way on purpose. We'll talk about that in just a moment, right? So these are wine aging decisions and styles that can be done and can be found all over. So with these decisions, we get a lot of like that sourdough, creme brulee, toffee, and nut flavor from these types of wines. So it's very cool. Okay, so Madeira. Madeira is a very, very old style of wine. It comes back or dates back from the age of exploration. So it's like near the 15th century. It was a standard to ship wine heading to the New World or West Indies. Wine was fortified to prevent it from spoiling on the ship. So they would add alcohol or spirits to the wine to keep it from spoiling, right? But they didn't know when they were shipping out this wine that the barrels were going to be exposed to a lot of heat and a lot of movement on the travels. They didn't have AC on ships back then. It got very hot, right? So because of that, it actually cooked the wine. So, and the only reason that the wine producers that were shipping this out at the time figured it out is because some of their shipments came back and they opened it and they were just like, this is not what we sent out. This is crazy that people are drinking this, right? So it still exists. It's from the island of Madeira, which is off of Portugal, but it's still made. People still use it, and a lot of people use it for cooking. There are some very cheap versions of cooking that also already have salt and pepper in them, which is really interesting. And you can now find Madeira in all styles. You can have it as a dry, a sweet wine, or as an aperitif. But because of its composition, Madeira wine can last for decades, even after being opened, which is really crazy. But it makes sense when you think about it, right? So it's been fortified, which we're going to talk about what makes a wine age here shortly. So it has a high alcohol. It's already been oxidized and it's already been cooked. So at that point, there's nothing else that you can do to this wine chemically except evaporate it, right, to a sludge. That's going to harm this wine. This is a tank. This is a tank, chemically speaking. You cannot damage this wine anymore, but it was done on purpose and it is consumed and it is enjoyed. So kind of fun. Okay, so bottle aging, right? So what happens to a wine as it ages? This is a very critical time for these tertiary aromas to develop. This is very much kind of like the Somm perspective for bottle aging, right? So we see changes in color, flavors, and textures. This is like the big three, right? An interesting thing too is not all wines are meant to be aged, and aging a wine is not a cure-all for fixing wine that is out of balance, right? It does help sometimes, but not all the time. So a lot of people be like, oh, just give it time, give it time. If you are going wine tasting and you do not like something, don't buy into the just give it time, okay? There are some situations where that's just an easy sell, just to be like, it just needs time. If you don't like it, you probably just don't like it. Okay, anyways, changes in color. Color changes over time as a wine ages, right? So that's because we get microoxygenation through the cork, and that's mostly it, right? So as the wine ages, for reds, generally speaking, red wines tend to have a purple hue when they're very young and very new. And then over time, they become more red and more of this like brick red, and then they kind of turn brown, right? For a white wine, typically it starts very light and clear, and then it becomes more and more yellow and then brown. So brown is always the end result as they lose color in the age, but there is an evolution, right? So as we look into the glass as we're tasting wines, this is why we spend a lot of time on color, because we can start to understand how fresh the wine is, how young the wine is, or old, And then also like what types of flavors we can expect based off of just that, right? So it's very interesting. Okay, for the aromas, we see an evolution of primary aromas starting to diminish and tertiary aromas starting to come into light. So secondaries, tertiaries, primaries is a lot of that fruit, right? And then secondary, tertiary is a lot of that creaminess, and then all the spices or things imparted from the barrel, if they used a barrel, right? So if you like fruity wines, like really fruity wines, you are going to want young wines. If you like all of that complexity of like a wine that you sip on, cinnamon, allspice, whatever, that oak characteristics, mushroom, you're going to want aged wines. That's generally how it goes, right? And so sometimes you see people buying cases of the same wine because they like it so much they want to see how it ages, right? And people gain those Coravins too, right? It puts that needle through the cork and then it replaces it with a gas so you can try it as you go. So they are trying to see, they like it as it is when they purchase it, but they want to see when the perfect time to drink it, when all of those flavors come together into a wonderful, complex beverage, right? So that's kind of like when people are like, oh, is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? So that's where that conversation starts to happen. It's because those aromas are always changing. Wine is a really interesting thing because I like to say it's living. It's always evolving. It's always changing. You might put a cork in it and set it aside, but it's not going to taste the same next month or next year or even the next 5 years. It's going to continually change, which is cool. Okay, changes in texture. As a wine ages, tannins start to diminish, right? As we're talking about, they don't just vanish into thin air, they polymerize and the wine becomes a lot more pleasant to drink because it's not so grippy, right? So typically, positive terms for tannin descriptors to be grippiness, chewy, silky, and polished. I like silky the best. Silky tannins are, in my opinion, the best descriptor for a wine that has aged well. But generally, or always, if they're using descriptors like green, astringent, or unripe tannin, those are negative descriptors for tannin texture in wine, right? So think about the difference of like the black tea that we talked about versus like chewing on like a tomato stem or something, right? It's going to be like not so pleasant. Okay. All right. Then last but not least, we'll talk about which wines can age, right? So you say, okay, well, I purchased this wine and I really like it, but I want to try aging it. Like, how do I know which wines can age versus which wines shouldn't? Or maybe you already have a collection and you're trying to figure out what you should drink sooner or what you should hold on to over time. So wines that age have some or all of these characteristics. There's sugar, alcohol, acid, and tannin. So we'll dive into that, right? So for sugar, wines that have a lot of sugar age longer, right? So we're talking 10 to 20% residual sugars are sweet wines, which is the same as 100 to 200 grams per liter. So sugar is a natural preservative. So that's why jams, preserves, and honey last a long time. Things were preserved in honey, which is kind of crazy. So wine examples for this would be Sauternes, ports, Tokay, German or Alsatian Rieslings. These will age anywhere between 15 to 50 years, which is crazy, right? And so why the range? It depends on other factors and how it was made and how it's being stored, right? Wine should always be stored in a temperature and controlled environment, in the dark, preferably in a wine fridge or in the back of your closet or something in a room that always gets AC, right? You don't want fluctuations in temperature or any extremes. Okay, so if you're saying I have no idea what residual sugar is in wine or even sweetness, these are general categories of wine sweetness. We have a dry white, a dry red, off dry sweet, port, sherry, and then dessert / ice wines, right? So you have two columns because people talk about residual sugar in different ways. Some people use percent and some people use grams per liter, right? So all you have to know is that it's off just by 1 decimal point. So 0.1 to 0.2% is 1 to 2 grams per liter, right? So that's, generally speaking, that is the range for a dry white wine. A dry red wine could be 0.2 to 0.3. Off dry is 1 to 3%. And then sweet wines are anything over 3%. And then dessert wines, 10 to 20%, right? So these can be pretty sweet. We don't really have, I don't think we really have like regulations in the US about what to call it. And a lot of winemakers that I talk to say that, the difference between dry and off dry is just simply your personal perception of sweetness on the finish of a wine, right? So take these numbers with a grain of salt, is all I'll say. This is a good starting point if you're curious, but a lot of people will go based off of just perception, right? If you're going to get into winemaking and you say, I want to make a dessert wine, then this is going to be what you shoot for your percentage of sugar, right? So just something to think about. Okay, alcohol. Fortifying. Fortifying just means adding spirits or adding alcohol to a beverage, right? So fortifying has always been a good way to preserve alcohol or wine. Most spoilage microbes cannot live in an environment above 16% ABV, which is great, right? So this is where you see a lot of those movies where someone gets hurt and they pour like a bottle of vodka on the wound. It's because it's such high alcohol, no yeast or bacteria, no microorganisms going to live through that, right? So that is why we see that, right? So, but that's generally for spirits. It doesn't count. I wouldn't recommend pouring just wine on someone's wound. It's not going to be a good day. Okay. Although that technically, okay, we're not going to get into that. Okay. So, according to one of the textbooks I was reading, it said in still wines, lower alcohol is generally better, 13.5 below, because, alcohol is volatile in non-fortified wines and causes wine to turn to vinegar more quickly. If you're going to have vinegar forming in your wine, it's going to happen because oxygen exposure and low SO2 levels, which if that sounded like alien to you, don't worry. So take this with a grain of salt. This is just what the textbook I was reading said. I don't necessarily agree with it. My big takeaway that I want you to know from this presentation is alcohol preserves wine. So wines that have high amounts of alcohol, and we're talking like 17 to 20%, will age for a long time. So examples of this would be ports, sherry, Madeira, and vermouth. These are all very high alcohol beverages. Okay, next is acid. Acid is also a preservative in wine. So when we measure acid in wine, it's through pH, right? In this aspect, right? We also do total acidity. That's more of a sensory measurement, but acid is for pH is what we look at for longevity and health of a wine. So pH will, first of all, determine the stability of the wine. It will prevent harmful organisms from growing and spoiling the wine, and it will determine the effectiveness of SO2 in wine. So SO2 is a preservative that we add to preserve freshness, aromas, and flavors. So, and there's a legal limit to how much we can add to wine for what is safe for consumers. So, disclaimer there. Textbook-wise, what's ideal pH for wines? For reds, 3.6 and lower. Whites, 3.2 or lower, and then sparkling 3.0 or lower than that for pH, right? And I say ideal in quotation marks because I have had really good wines that have been at 4.0 pH for red, or a really good white that's been at 3.6, right? So it really depends. This is just a benchmark if you're new to winemaking and you just want to keep all of your, parameters within range of what's healthy, right? So that's why ideal is in quotations. Okay, tannin. The more tannin a wine has, the more it's going to be likely to age, right? So tannins come from oak, berry skins, seeds, and stems, right? And so this helps with the oxygenation, right? It keeps the wine. They dissipate over time, or they polymerize, right? And it helps to smooth out the texture, and the wine becomes less astringent, right? So that is a portion of why wines age well. So this is why we see like a lot of like those really big Bordeaux reds that are dry and low alcohol aging for so long. It's because they have high acid and high tannin, right? So they don't have the sugar or the alcohol component, but they have acid and tannin. So that's where that combination comes into, right? That's why those reds last for so long. Okay. So we don't want necessarily red wines without any tannin because tannins help contribute to structure and texture of a wine. And a wine that doesn't have those things would be kind of sad for a red wine, right? Which kind of begs the question, does a white wine have tannin? Right? So think about the white wine making process, how the fruit is harvested, and then crushed and pressed, and then we just ferment on the juice, right? So technically speaking, wine does not have tannin unless you extracted some from the skins and seeds during the uh, processing portion of that, right? So, but wine has a lot of acid, and it also has alcohol, which will contribute to that as well. And if it's sweet, that's another texture component. Okay, so long-winded presentation. Thank you guys for hanging in there. It's probably one of my longer ones. But here are your learning objectives. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, and I will catch you guys next time.